wasn't halfway through the interview. This one's still
I
rolling.
guess now we can kind of transition to what we had in mind for now.
If I'm sitting on the board of directors of an organization.
Before we get to today,
Right.
We want to know how did you start? What was it like? What brought you into the educational space to be a professor, to join FINRA, all this work?
Sure. It's interesting. You know, you start out with one field and then you learn that it. I went to school in Philadelphia at Temple University, and I was going to be a pharmacist. And I went in as a pharmacy major. And I realized after one semester, chemistry and all that stuff was not for me. So I switched to political science and then public administration. But while I was at Temple, I taught. Temple those days had their own separate engineering school. So I was on the faculty of them, and I taught courses in English, psychology, sociology, if you could believe.
Mm-hmm.
But I was the youngest one hired, so when it came time for layoffs, I was the first one to go. But I had graduated, at that point graduated from Temple and got my master's in public administration. And through somebody, one of my relatives, he had a friend who was working for an agency that Governor Nelson Rockefeller had started. And they were giving away monies, I shouldn't say giving away, they were funding projects under Richard Nixon's war on crime.
Mm-hmm.
It was called the Safe Streets Act. And to the extent that we would give grants to police, courts, corrections, that type of thing. So I got a job with them. The most fascinating thing, it tripled my salary as being a teacher at Temple. I mean, it was I had money, I could live. So I moved from Philadelphia up to New York. And while I was working there, I also taught at CW Post College. I taught a graduate course in criminal justice. From there, I went on to work for the county head up in Westchester County. He had founded a similar operation, and I went up there to help run it. And then from there, I had enough and just decided, time to take a break, so I did. And I spent a couple of years wandering the world, just exploring. When I came back to New York, I started doing consulting. And I worked for a number of different agencies, including doing some teaching up at CCNY. I taught a course in public administration. But one of my clients was Citibank. And while I was at Citibank, they mentioned to me, would I be interested in applying for a job in the organization's human resources. Well, it wasn't necessarily it wasn't a principal interest, but it was a job. Mm-hmm. And so I took it. And frankly, I thought maybe I spend a year. And 17 years later, I was still there. It is amazing. But while I was at Citi, it was quite an education. I was very much involved, since I came out of a criminal justice background. I knew about a lot of the laws and things that applied to really employees. So I got very much involved with those issues. I was also very much involved with the issue of ethics. Mm-hmm. I was a fellow in Washington at the Ethics Resource Center, which is comprised of representatives from both government and private sector who are interested in the issues of how you manage organizations and what are the issues of like integrity, confidentiality, that you apply to your own organization, or what can you learn from others. So I was representing Citi in that. Also it was fun traveling all around the world, everywhere from Tegucigalpa over to Nairobi, London, France, Stockholm, you name it. And again, it was quite an education of how people are managed around the world. And even though you work for one company, you work in different organizations and in different cultures. And people come with all this baggage of what is right and what is wrong, and things that we would accept as being, unethical or maybe not quite right. Other places, it's fine.
That's what we were wondering.
Yeah. I mean, who do you give business to except your brother, your uncle, your son? Whereas in the States, we would look upon that as nepotism. You don't do that. You go out and you find the best available person to do the job. You don't want to give your money, in this case the organization's money, to your sister, to your uncle, just because they happen to be your sister and uncle. And yet in many countries around the world, standard practice. Who are you going to trust except for those? And so it becomes, from a corporate point of view, a real challenge. Here you are sitting, whether you're in London or in New York City, or you're sitting in Japan, or wherever you run your multinational corporation, and you're trying to make rules and regulations and try to come up with codes of conduct. And yet you realize that you are spanning multiple cultures, multiple nationalities, multiple religions, multiple social economic situations. So, it's hard to say one rule easily. Exactly. So I did that for about 17 years, and then left and started, I did some writing of the book in front of you. Also, through some friends of mine, I went to Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and I started teaching a course on compliance and ethics. The nice thing about what's called SEPA is the fact that it's all graduate school. Most of the people have had work experience. They've been military officers, they worked in government, they worked for, often it was their foreign service who sent them to school to get their master's degree. And so you had all this diverse background. And a couple of things I did at SEPA that really interested me beyond teaching this course. One, most schools have what they call capstone programs, right, which is in your senior year, you work on a project. SEPA has a capstone program. And in the course of the years that I had my involvement with the capstone, I had students working everywhere from Malaysia to Nairobi to Buenos Aires.
And Brazil.
I'm sorry.
And Brazil, right? And
Brazil. I had them in Rio, had them in Brasilia, had them up north. And it was interesting, the projects they worked on really scanned the works. I have them in Mexico City. And again, either it was for a government agency, it could be like for some kind of NGO who's looking to expand into a new area. But the idea was to give them practical experience of what it's like to work for a client who may be demanding, but the issues are fine. Some of my students have gone on to work for these very organizations who had sponsored them on these SEPA trips. So that was fun. And then Columbia brings in every year 10 people from around the world. It's called the Human Rights Program. And these are advocates who run organizations that, frankly, I would never have the courage to do. They deal with gay and lesbian rights in Africa or the Middle East, or they deal with issues of people who have been abused, and or with families of prisoners around the world. So for a number of years, I've been lecturing them on managing their organizations.
Mm-hmm.
They have the same issues as anybody else. They have issues of funding, they have issues of staffing, they have issues of clients, they have issues of reputation. And to the extent that while they may be doing God's work, they are still managing people and managing issues and dealing with money.
Mm-hmm. And
there's no getting away from it. I've had people say to me, well, I don't, I did some work here in New York at some point, and it was for this NGO. And I remember the staff saying to me, I didn't come here to become a, quote, bureaucrat, unquote.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't want to deal with paperwork. This is stuff that, I'm here to help. I'm here to help the people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I got news for you. Someone's paying for you to be here to help the people. Someone is giving you the, quote, facilities that you're using. Someone is really expecting to see some progress made. And how do you justify that? But by, unfortunately, writing a report. And it's always, interesting to, when you work with people, to say, listen, I understand you're here to do good, but doing good, it still entails management. And so I did that for a number of years, lecturing. Every year they bring in a new cadre of people.
Mm-hmm.
And they went back to South America, they went back to Eastern Europe, they went back to Asia, Africa. So that was really fun. In addition, periodically over the last several years, under UN sponsorship, they brought in indigenous leaders from around the world. So again, talk to them about managing their own organizations. So whether you were someone you were a Sami up in Finland or Stockholm or Sweden, or if you were down in South America, or if you were Aboriginal in Australia, all had same management problems.
Mm-hmm.
Of dealing with organizations and those type of things. So that is kind of, to answer a long-winded way, just your question of how I got involved with it.
So, that was your entire life summed up.
Yeah.
So is it fair to say that you became passionate in the work of these 10 people who would come to Columbia, and then through that passion you saw that their issue was compliance management, and that's what got you into that field of work?
It's actually, it wasn't because of them. It was the fact that I could talk about what I knew to help them.
Right.
It was being able to apply issues of compliance and ethics to people who really have very serious challenges.
Mm-hmm.
So that they can manage their organizations much more effectively. And so that part is fun. It's certainly more fun than working with some bank somewhere. That could be a challenge, but these are people who really are on the cutting edge of their own societal issues. And to the extent that if I can help them and help them manage, that is terrific.
So it sounds like a lot of these leaders and people you're talking about were running into the same issues when it comes to management.
did you use a lot of the same methods and strategies to help them with their problems, or did you have to navigate through different cultures and belief systems to use different approaches?
That's a good question. A lot of it is fairly generic. I mean, to the extent of how you manage. I remember someone from West Africa who was complaining about boards of directors. It's an issue that you hear, that someone on the board of the country that is overseeing their operation is maybe interfering with their program. And those are issues that, you know, have come up all around the world. It's not just unique to this one country in West Africa. And you try to look at the issues. You try to look at who are the people, what's the dynamic. Sometimes there are no clear answers. You know, I lie to you to say that there's an easy solution. Often there aren't. But at least let's understand what is the issue. And, let's look at possible strategies for dealing with it. Sometimes you have a brilliant idea, and other times you walk out saying, "Oh God, you know, we are going nowhere with this." But the idea is that you challenge yourself, even challenge your own beliefs, saying, you know, maybe they have a point. You know, maybe I'm much too stringent. Maybe I'm imposing my own values on them when it's not just your question. It's just not going to fly in their own culture. You know, I can only do the best that I can, or you can only do the best you can within the context of the societal entity, the political, religious, it could be tribal, family, ethnic. You know, you go through the range of things, but how do you manage it, or how can you try to manage it?
And let's say you're working with a country who has religion deeply embedded into their governmental structure.
Sure.
And they want those ethics to play into their businesses.
Yeah.
And you have, you know, a separate set of American ethics that you're used to working with. And even to add a further layer of complexity, there's people from one country working with people from a different country.
Very much.
How do you manage those interactions?
Sometimes you can't. You can only do what you think is best. There are times when, unfortunately, you're not going to change. If I was, you know, in the world of like the Taliban, and you know, and I want to, you know, teach music, or you know, it's there are limits to what you can realistically do. Now you have to be true to your own values, and this gets to the other point. At what point do you begin to question your own beating your head against the wall? Am I doing any good?
Right.
You know, am I ultimately going to bring the government down on my own operation by trying to forever challenge them? And so you have to look at your own self values and your own integrity, and say to yourself, you know, maybe this is not working out. Maybe I can do something different someplace else. I've tried, but it's just not going to happen. On the other hand, you have to, you know, how much are you willing to go along with the system? And I've had students ask me that. I had one young woman, she was from another country in Africa, and we were talking about ethics and compliance and stuff, and she said that the whole country is so corrupt. How do I keep my own values, and how do I try to manage in a basic society that won't let me, because everything I have to do is based on behaviors that I really consider to be unethical, corrupt, illegal, And I said, it's not an easy, that no one can give you an easy answer. Certainly I can't. But at some point you have to look at your own values and say, is this right?
Right.
Yeah.
And as you're making these recommendations, it seems like you kind of brought it up. There's a lot of moving parts here. There's laws specific to each country's.
Right.
There's corporate policies that they might have, and there's also your own personal moral beliefs. Is there a way that you would kind of rank these in terms of what's most important to you when you're making recommendations?
No, I'd lie to say one is more important than another. I think to the extent that when we talk about, and it doesn't have to be talking about going into some, third world developed country. I mean, just look at going into business in like the United States. How do you choose an organization, in terms of your own values and in terms of how you want to be involved with that organization? And it gets to your point. For example, we are all products of our religion, our family, our culture, our nationalities, our socioeconomic status. I mean, all these converge in forming who we are, what are our principles, our values. The question is, as you begin to choose looking for employment opportunities, how do you manage, and how do you create a marriage between what your values are and between what the organization that you're looking at or company, and are my values and are my ethics compatible with theirs? And I can't say, to answer your question, that it's the issue of religion or class or whatever, but they're all factors. Let me give you a classic example. You want to work for an organization that needs you on weekends. If you're a Catholic, they want you on Sunday. If you're a Muslim, they want you on Fridays. If you're a Jew, they want you on Saturdays. How much are you willing to sacrifice, in this case, your own religious values and ethics, to meet the requirements of your, quote, employer? I mean, these are the questions that people have to judge all the time. I mean, is this something that I'm willing to do?
And what about in the context that we spoke about, that country in Africa, the woman was asking, how does she justify doing something that's unethical to her? In America, we have a lot more options. So we can sort of decide between a company that would make a person work on a religious observance they're not. But there's countries where people don't have that option, and they need to, for example, bribe people just to get through their day, or they need to work. For a company that doesn't allow them to observe these religious holidays.
Right.
How would a person navigate that?
You have to make. There is no easy answer to that. And one of the issues is even letting yourself getting into that type of situation. Knowing that if I'm going to work at in XYZ group, or in this case country, do I even want to do that? I know I'm not naive. I know what the pressures are going to be like. Do I even want to force myself to have to confront that, rather than saying, I know it's not going to happen. What am I doing this for? For whatever reason, I can't say. But I think to the extent that, you have to make a choice in that case and say, you know what, I'm just not sure this is going to be what I want to do. I've been lucky in the sense of I haven't had to go into another country and face those. I mean, I've certainly been with lots of people who have had that experience. But I think to the extent that, these are world challenges where you have to say, you know what, this is not for me. I mean, and yes, you feel, I'm not up to it. I didn't deliver what I had hoped to be able to deliver. But I think you also realize there comes a point where, it ain't gonna happen.
Right.
And the same, like we were talking about jobs. You get a wonderful employment opportunity or company, and suddenly, the question that I pose to my students, especially when they've been as they graduate, and is, who are you? What are you picking? What are you looking at? In terms of the potential organization that you're going to work for. What's their reputation? Have they been sued 1 million times for some of their behaviors? Who do they do business with? The issue is, it's not just the fact that, we believe in God and country, and and we believe in civil rights, and and gay and lesbian opportunities, and all the other things that you hear. That's fine. But the reality is, who's their management? Who do they contract with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are the policies that they have on paper, but what is reality? I'll tell you a story. When I was at Citi, we periodically had to do work for the corporation's board of directors. And they met on a Monday. And on Saturday, we would often go in to get ready, to really prepare for the forthcoming meeting. And I remember it was one day, and I worked for someone who was very much, again, this is in the early 90s, and very much involved in family-friendly policies and parental leave and all these other wonderful things. But we were having a technical problem setting up something. And she says to us, well, where is Joe Blow, who's our tech person? And someone said, well, Joe is home. His wife just had a baby, and he wanted to be with her. And this person, who is family friendly, said, if he wants something warm and fuzzy, why doesn't he just get a damn cat? The bottom line was, I need you, I need you. We have policies in place that are wonderful. They smack of progressive and understanding. But when the bottom line comes, how much are you really going to draw on that? And how much is it, I need your ass in here? And I don't care if you had a little baby.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't make it, then we have to talk potentially about if this is the right, is this the right place for you? Or if I'm Joe Blow saying, is this the right place for me?
Right.
They talk about these fabulous policies, but it's all words on a piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
How do they influence it? So getting back, it's like, who is this organization that you want to work for? What is your compensation based on? What are the elements of it? What do they value in terms of employee behavior? So there are a lot of things that you look at that you have to make a determination. Same as someone going into another country who's making a relatively analogous type of really that determination.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it seems like we're getting brought back always to the idea of who gets to decide what is ethical and what isn't. And I want to bring up the example of offshoring.
Okay.
So, for example, in Beijing, where the minimum wage is $4,
Mm-hmm.
that's actually the highest in China. But to us as Americans, we see that as, you can't survive off of that, you can't live off of that. And I think a lot of what it brings us to is, how do we decide whether it's ethical for companies to use those kinds of labor practices? And do we need to consider that, for example, no air conditioning in factories in Beijing might be the normal practice there, whereas here we would see that as completely appalling?
It depends on, and you don't have to go to India for this issue. I'll tell you a story in a second. Yeah, I mean, what are the labor standards in the country? What are your companies or your own industry's labor standards in terms of, does the employer, the offshore, party, do they meet any of the standards set by some of the international organizations? Yes, money is crucial. I mean, there's no minimizing it. I mean, money is money. To the extent that if they are the principal employer in that area, I wouldn't, it's relative in terms of the dollar amount. What is crucial is how they treat their employees. And does the employer meet the standards set by international organizations or by your own industry? Mm-hmm. And the question is, if they don't, why are you doing business with them? I mean, that's something that, in this case, management of the company has to make a decision and say, in essence, I don't care if they don't give them, standards call for air conditioning, a break, water break, name the other principal things that you would have. They don't do any of it, or they employ 5-year-old kids to do some menial thing. To the extent that, is it worth it to me to keep on doing business with them when it appears that they violate all laws or the standards of doing business? Mm-hmm. Now, if I'm sitting on the board of directors of an organization, would I not want to ask a question of, who's manufacturing your shirts? Mm-hmm. What are the conditions in which you're paying for it? Now, we're making a profit from it, obviously. We wouldn't be doing it otherwise. But, I mean, so who's contracting? Who are we contracting with? What is our oversight of what they say? They can have a contract that sounds like mom and apple pie. And yet, when you get out into the field and you see that conditions are nowhere near that, who has the authority to say, we're terminating this relationship? On the other hand, what becomes much more complicated, they are the only game in town. How do we put up with it? I need them. And it becomes a real issue. Now, if an NGO has gone in and has looked at the working conditions, do we then take notice of what they've said? Do we care enough what the NGO says, that the XYZ production company is maltreating its employees? On the other hand, it may be the only employer in the area where people can make a living from. It is complicated. I'll give you an example, much closer to home, right across the river here in Manhattan. When I worked at Citibank, we had a policy starting in the late 80s you cannot employ anyone who hasn't taken a drug test. Okay? We wanted people to be drug-free.
Mhm.
Fine. That also included vendors to the corporation. And if you're gonna have people working on Citibank property, touching the assets of the corporation, touching people's, money, customers' money, we wanna make sure that they are drug-free because it is risk and you're managing risk. We found out there was a manager who was employing a company to do very serious and sensitive work on like banking operations. The organization who he was contracting with did not believe in drug testing. They found it offensive. But he went ahead and hired them anyway because he needed them. And as they threatened him, well, you want to impose drug testing on us? I'll go take it to Manufacturers Hanover or Chemical or Chase, and they'll use our knowledge. And this guy went ahead and employed these people in violation of corporate policy because he needed them, or he felt he needed them, and he had no other option. And then eventually it came to light and the situation was stopped. But it's the same type of thing, it's complicated. There are no easy answers. I met somebody once in like the DR who was doing dress manufacturing. And suddenly he said, we're moving our operations from the DR over to Haiti because the Haitian wage were much lower. So why am I paying someone $3 an hour in the DR when I can pay $1 for the same manufacture of whatever, probably piece of clothing. And so, but it comes down to money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting the way that you're showing just how complex it is to source the way that a product or a service is being offered all the way through, and
Right.
how complex it actually is. Now we're seeing a trend of a lot of people voting with their dollar or ethically consuming, but a lot of people and consumers specifically might feel overwhelmed by how complex it actually is.
Sure.
Do you think there's a way organizations could simplify that process and make it easier for people to make informed choices? For example, assigning ESG scores for each product being manufactured so people see the
Right.
way that, what's going into it, and
I
letting
know.
people decide that.
Yeah. ESG is an interesting topic, It's
We made an episode about it.
We
You
did,
did?
a couple
Yeah.
of weeks ago.
yeah. I mean, the whole issue of ESG. Are you talking about people? I mean, companies like shareholders, or you're talking about?
I mean, from a consumer standpoint.
Yeah.
For example, like two separate products, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so yeah.
choosing whether you want to pay a premium for one product made super ethically versus Nike sneakers that
Right.
even their own former CEO would say that they employed basically slave labor to create.
I remember once hearing a lecture about this, about Levi jeans or jeans knockoffs, and how many people actually that they went for the cheaper jeans, even though it probably did not meet the same standards of manufacturing as like a Levi. It was price, not necessarily. Now you will find some people certainly would be loath to buy something that would be manufactured by in terrible circumstances and meet none of the ESG standards. But if it's a choice between two products, one is $18.95 and one is $7.95. They look the same, they feel the same. am I willing to spend $11 more for that product? Because it has the ESG label of, excellence.
Yeah.
And I think you will find some who will, but I think you will find others who'll say, listen, who cares? And tell me, how do you define ESG? I mean,
That's we actually talked about that on our podcast. It's hard to give a clear definition of that.
And there's a ton of different, since it's relatively new, there's a bunch of different rating agencies. So there's no standard of 0 to 100
Sure.
or ABC.
yeah,
They like to split it up into environmental, social, and then
Governance.
and how the company is managed. Exactly.
right. Yeah, no, there are no easy answers. I had a team of students working on a project for an entity based in Amsterdam, and they were looking to come up with ratings on some projects, and the students wrestled with this, and they're like, it gets back to your point, like, what is more important, and like, how do you choose in terms of the quote, what are the criteria which are most important? And this is where you get the issues of ethics, of really integrity. What is most important? If you're running an organization, since we took it, let's focus like on G. What are the values? What are the criteria that are most important in terms of managing this entity? Is it, again, the words on a piece of paper? Is it the managing to that? Is it the people we hire? Is it the products that we sell? Is it the people that we do business with? Is it the people that we give money to in terms of our own foundations, on our own, who do we support? I mean, which of these criteria are most important, or they're all lumped together?
Yeah.
And then you kind of give it a base score of, 1 million as compared to 999,000,
Yeah.
And there is no easy answer. If I want to have a company that I think is going to have the best product, we are testing it. We make sure that it's safe, that it'll be widely available. We'll help subsidize people who cannot afford to purchase it. That's fine. But the people who also run this company are, a bunch of sleaze buckets. What is most important? And I think in some ways it's up to each individual as to, except if I'm a shareholder.
Yeah.
What is important to me? The profit, return on my own investment. Is this the type of company I would be proud to have in my own portfolio? Or would it be embarrassing if someone ever asked me, did you really have money in, the XYZ group? And you'd have to justify it.
Right. I want to ask you specifically about Sarbanes-Oxley. You mentioned it a lot in your book.
Yeah.
And you spoke specifically about how when Sarbanes-Oxley was passed, the SEC implemented a code that said, and I have the exact wording here, it says, compliance with applicable government laws, rules, and regulations. Do you think it's a little bit redundant for them to say, it seems obvious to us that you would have to follow the law.
Right.
And now the SEC is passing an additional, ruling that says you have to follow the law.
They were requiring that the internal controls by which you operate, they wanted the senior management of that organization to attest that we have the internal controls in my shop that I feel confident that we are managing it.
Mhm.
Because people weren't managing it. And to the extent, and again, when I wrote the book, Sarbanes-Oxley was, it was a popular topic. Now, years later, it's, ancient history.
It was really important though as a turning point.
At the time, it was very important. But the idea was to put teeth into the oversight of the organization.
Mhm.
And so in this case, they wanted the CEO. They wanted the chief. I think it was the chief accountant or the CEO to attest that we do have internal controls, and that they are being monitored. If they have to be changed, we'll change them, but that it's not being ignored. You just can't say everything is kosher.
Yeah.
People look at the Arthur Anderson Enron issues, where the accounting firms went in and just kind of gave them a blank ticket. The government said we wanted to learn, and we need internal controls that are going to look at how well we are managing our policies, our practices, our codes. Do we even do self-testing? Go into an organization and ask, how do you know if your controls are working?
Mhm.
Do you ever test them? Do you ever know what's going on? Who has oversight in your shop? For example, if you have an accounting function, who has a blank check to make out a check, or someone who can then can oversee it?
Mhm.
You're both technology gurus. When was the last time your organization looked at issues of password security, network security? When was the last time anyone looked at how we are managing, access? What do you do with your laptops? What do you do with your drives? What happens to this stuff? And if you went in and someone said, gee, that's a good question, that is a problem. It should not be a good question.
Mhm.
It should be, we are constantly overseeing it, and we know whether it's, and especially now that everybody is working from home, or, a lot of people are working from home. How do you manage it? If you want to feel secure, how do you feel? What are the policies and practices that you being the company, I'm giving you the job,
Right.
of making sure that I can attest to my CEO, we are good, or I think we're good, or I pray we're good, or I hope we're good.
Mhm.
But I used to say to people when I went out and I audited, what's the thing that kept you awake at 3 o'clock in the morning with saying, oh my God, if anybody ever knew? And it happens all the time. And the question therefore follows up with, well, what are you doing about it? Don't be up here at 3 o'clock in the morning saying, oh my God, this is a potentially horrific situation. What is the amount of risk it is, and how are you dealing with it?
Mhm.
And so to the extent that, people, it's like, it used to be a thing where people would often say, I wish Joe Blow left. Let him disappear, or let her disappear. Like they're the problem.
Mhm.
Just make him vanish, and I'll sleep the whole night. I won't have to worry. But the reality is that you've got to deal with it, and that's one of the challenges. It's like going back to your thing about the offshoring.
Yeah.
And you're the CEO. You've got to go over to a board meeting and said, you know what, we got to close down operations in XYZ country. because they are abysmal. And someone's going to ask you, okay, so where are you going now? And you sit there and say, gee, we haven't figured it out yet. And that board member would say, why are we paying you a salary? I expect you have the answer.
Right.
And to the extent that, you know, suddenly you find yourself in dire straits. I said, if I'm on the board, I expect you to really know what's going on and give me a choice. If that is terrible, give me an option which I can live with.
Do you think employees should be responsible for oversights of management?
That's an interesting question. You know, there are 360 performance evaluations where people do evaluate their bosses. I mean, yes, I think they should, but they're scared. I'll give you a good example. Years ago, I was down in City used to have an operation outside of Miami where they were controlling all the different technology operations in Central and South America, and over in the good old Caribbean from down in South Florida. And I was in there once and doing some auditing, and someone pulled me aside, and she said to me, you know, we have a vendor here who I'm scared to death of. You know, they come in here, they work late at night. I'm scared of the people that they use. And I said to her, why don't you say something to somebody? And she goes, I can't say that to my boss. You know, it was a sense of intimidation. And there's a sense of, you know, there is retribution. I mean, that's why people have whistleblowing or hotlines where they feel they can't go to their boss or their boss's boss, which is more important. So they'll raise an issue, and that'll be one way of doing it. But I think, yes, I think you should be able to, especially when that individual is doing something wrong. You know, listen, people are people. Because the person is a pain in the ass, or they have a wicked sense of humor, or they're just a jerk, that's one thing. Maybe they shouldn't be managing people, which is another issue. But okay, they're the manager. But if that person is doing something illegal, unethical, treating people, you know, unfairly, and it's causing problems and really like morale, then yes, you should, because it's affecting the business. You know, it's never anything personal. The work is not getting done because this person is doing X, Y, and Z. And only then, or I'll be quite blunt, that's when senior management listens. They may say, okay, you know, David is, you know, he's a jerk, but you know, things are moving along and blah, blah, blah. But if I come to him and say, you know what, we have a real problem.
You have to make it about money, is what you're saying.
Yeah, ultimately. I mean, if you talk about if it comes like employee morale,
Yeah.
that's bad. But if work is not getting done, or people have their resumes out looking for jobs because they can't stand working for this guy, that does affect the operation of the organization, and it does come down ultimately to money. I mean, you want an entity that's going to be functioning effectively. You want people who are able to trust each other, people who feel a sense of loyalty to their employer. But when they see someone managing who does not espouse that language, or more importantly, really it's that behavior, that people begin to say, what am I here for? You know, and of course you can justify it a million ways of why you're there, but Yes, I know I'm much too long-winded, but
No, it's
Yeah.
interesting.
And
Interesting.
it's interesting you brought up whistleblowers. I know in your book you were talking about the importance of corporations setting up the whistleblowing and the hotline programs.
Yeah.
How do you encourage whistleblowers without creating, I guess, a toxic environment where you feel you're under constant judgment and being watched by your coworkers?
And just to add to that really quick, during COVID, we saw a lot of companies were having these hotlines for people who didn't wear masks.
Yeah.
Just as a more concrete example.
Yeah, I mean, I think managers have to know, and senior managers, that whistleblowers, that there is a hotline there, and that potentially someone could raise an issue. I mean, there's no doubt. We had like smoking in the workplace was an issue that people love going onto the hotline for. You know, so and so goes into the bathroom and smokes.
Yeah.
And no one chastised the person. But it's. I mean, I worked on the hotline at one point. I was very much involved with it, and to the extent that sometimes real issues. I mean, you get the issue of someone smoking in the workplace. Okay,
Right.
fine. But I think to the extent that someone can raise a serious issue that they feel that their boss may be the problem, or their boss's boss, but they are afraid of vengeance. The people are going to take out,
Retaliation.
they're going to retaliate against them, and retaliation's a real issue. It's your job. Also, feeling that your colleagues, there's no such thing as a secret, as you know from school and from organizations. Everybody essentially gets to know everything else, and suddenly they say, "Oh, David, they're both rats." Sure, you know, and they're the ones who ratted on Joe Blow, and we don't want to work with a rat, that type of thing. But I think it's good. I mean, it's to the extent that the hotline should not just be limited just to employees, but go up to the board of directors. If you feel that we're doing business in the XYZ country, and it is horrific, every NGO going has lambasted it. Every industry group has said it's terrible, and I think it's your responsibility to raise the issue with the board of directors and say, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? We know why, but why are we doing this? Is it worth our reputation? Because ultimately it comes down to reputation.
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent that if someone is, David is I see that David is shelling out corporate funds to a company that like his cousin owns.
Yeah.
And there's no competitive bidding. He's giving his cousin a freebie. He does the work, but it's not appropriate. Nobody has said anything. I think that it would be appropriate to raise the issue. Then you have the audit people go in and they'll look at how David's cousin got the contract, the quality of the work. Maybe it's perfectly fine, but why did they not go through a competitive bidding process? Could they have gotten someone better, cheaper, whatever? But they wouldn't know about it unless someone raised it as an issue. But it is a very sensitive issue. I mean, raising it, people are afraid of retaliation.
Yeah, and it's funny you bring up auditors. We already talked about Sarbanes-Oxley, but when it comes to Enron and specifically Arthur Andersen, they were an auditor that had a very active involvement in the scandal. they were accused of acting very unethically and
Yeah.
basically helping Enron
Yeah.
cook the books. So now, how would you ensure that the auditors are acting ethically and independently within companies that
Well, first of all, you have to go by reputation. I know Arthur Anderson
was
had
top five?
what?
Arthur Anderson was part of
One of
the
the big five.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it gets down to controls. It gets down to the fact of just because you hired God, in this case Arthur Anderson, doesn't mean you don't go question, what are you doing? How often are you seeing it? You know, you meet with them regularly, whoever has the contract for them, to question them. What are you doing? Let me see some of the work papers that you guys are putting together. Arthur Anderson wasn't doing this for free. They were getting paid. And would you hire anybody to do work for you and just give them carte blanche and say, go ahead and do it, and you know, let me know in 6 months everything is kosher? I'm not sure. And I think with something like them, you have to. They are a contractor to you, no more, no less. And to the extent that you want to know what's going on, ask them, question them. It's like if you have an accountant who's doing work with them, you ask them questions about, are we okay? What are the issues? You know, you try to get on their back a little bit so that you feel comfortable with what they're doing. And I think with Arthur Anderson, Enron just gave them carte blanche and said, I met a guy once at a cocktail party who had a friend who was on the board of Enron. And
He wasn't the most popular guy there?
well, no, but he said his friend who was the board member knew nothing about what was going on. Nothing. And that's what's scary. I had a friend of mine worked for a nonprofit school organization in New York. And it was fairly well known. And she was on the board. And there was a CEO who ran the organization, who technically reported to the board of directors who oversees them. She said the guy who was the head of the board was scared to death of this organization's CEO and would not ask him anything. I mean, you talk about shirking your responsibility. I mean, a board is supposed to be there for oversight.
Yeah.
And if you're not there to question what's going on, why are we doing, how are we doing, could we do things better, differently, blah, blah, blah. But she said the CEO would never answer any of the questions posed by the head of the board. And she said she quit. She said it's useless. But I think the Arthur Anderson thing was a classic example of absolute malfeasance.
Well, how can we ensure that corporations will act ethically when it's against their, I guess, fiscal and shareholder responsibilities to make as much money as they can?
Well, hopefully they have a board of directors who is ethical. Hopefully you have regulators who are looking after them. Hopefully you have NGOs who are looking at their operations. You have shareholders. And the shareholders who are saying, why are we putting up with, X, Y, and Z when our company is in dreadful condition?
Yeah.
You have institutional, you got New York State pensions, you got California pensions, who are enormous institutional shareholders who have significant influence, who should be saying, if they believe there is something wrong with where they put your dollars, or in this case, state employee dollars, or whatever, should say. what is going on, and say, we need a new management team. Because remember, it's not just the CEO, it's the people who work for him or her. And to the extent that, how are they behaving? What are their values? How are they performing? And to the extent of how does senior management get monitored? And I think to the extent that, you do have this oversight in terms of institutional, regulatory, shareholders, NGOs, and hopefully there would be enough pressure put on the organization that it would change. Nothing's going to happen overnight. This is like a battleship. You turn slowly, but someone has to begin to put the pressure on it to make the changes.
Right.
And since we're on the topic of, I guess, rights of employees, I want to bring up the decline we've seen of unions within the private sector. So in the 1950s, union membership was about 1/3 of the workforce in the private sector. Now it's at, as of 2021, 6%.
Yeah.
So is there a way that you could see the union model being revised? And if that's not possible, is there a next level of corporate structure that could also protect the rights of their employees?
Well, the nature of work has changed. Having worked in a large entity, unions were not popular. And I think it's an interesting question of, yes, union, population, union membership has,
Dropped
dwindled,
significantly.
significantly. But the nature of work has also changed dramatically. Where you have a large service and really information structure. You also have several generations of people growing up who have never worked for a union.
Yeah.
Maybe their parents and grandparents may have been union members, but unions were never part of their life. And I think to that extent, I think the AFL-CIO or whatever it's a challenge in this day and age. My father was a plumber, so he was a member of a union, but he worked for himself. And I think to the extent that union involvement is certainly in multinational corporations and many, it's just not it's just not a future. Now you can talk to a labor economist who has a much better but it brings up an interesting issue of values. And how do you deal with what a union's values may be, or ethics, as compared to what the corporation's ethics and values are? That's where you get to an interesting thing of what really dominates. What is the you have the some of the service delivery people who are who say that they want better working conditions and whatever, but it's an interesting issue. When you work for a large multinational corporation, for example, it's not just one oversight body, but there are different regulatory bodies. And I'll give you a classic example. We're going a little far afield, but for example, we have people, when I worked at the bank, who were broker dealers. And they were registered by those days. It was the NASD.
Mhm.
It's now called FINRA.
Mhm.
They had their set of regulations and codes of conduct, but they happened to be bank employees, and they were subject to bank rules and regulations. And we had cases where we wanted to do something against a bank employee, but they were also registered by the NASD. So technically you could not fire them
Mhm.
because they were subject to the rules and regulations of their oversight body,
Mhm.
which was the NASD. And so you had to deal with conflicting issues. We had a case where we continued to employ somebody who, even though the bank did not want him, he could not be fired because he was subject to their regulations and did not meet the criteria for termination of employment.
Right. When did you become a part of FINRA?
I'm sorry?
When did you become a member of FINRA?
Well, I started with NASD, and then it morphed into FINRA. God only
Mhm.
knows. But I went around the country teaching for them on compliance and ethics. I was obviously in New York. I was in Chicago, San Francisco, Miami, dealing with did it for about 10 years, and dealing with issues of compliance and ethics in their world.
Right.
And it's interesting, but yes, I forgot when NASD morphed into FINRA.
But I do want to bring up what I think right now is, I guess, a bit of a debate within the law and compliance and ethics community.
Sure.
Is, do you believe that compliance and ethics should be part of the law department, or should they be separated into two distinct?
Boy, that has always been the $64 question.
Mhm.
Even as I write in the book, there's been a big debate over that. Traditionally, it's been part of the legal department, because people have said, well, you're dealing with law and regulation, so naturally you'd be with lawyers. As one person said, if an issue is going to be raised through them, the chief legal officer has a lot of clout in organizations. On the other hand, a lot of what compliance and ethics do have nothing to do with a law department. Issues of looking at controls,
Yeah.
issues of training, issues of ethics, issues of working on codes of conduct are things that a law department is not involved with.
Right.
And so it's always been a debate who it should report to. Should it report directly to the CEO as a separate entity?
Yeah.
Should it be housed technically in the law department, but have a dotted line relationship up to like the CEO? So, even if the chief legal officer may not agree with what the senior compliance officer believes, but nevertheless, their view would be funneled up to the head of the organization. So it's been a debate, where it should be, because the roles are slightly different. A chief, the legal office could care less about training, could care less about codes of conduct, care less about internal controls. I mean, they are concerned when the issues have legal and technical consequences, yes, but on a routine basis, no. And the question is, should the head of compliance be an officer?
Right.
And I've seen it both ways. Do you need a lawyer? Or is a lawyer appropriate? And, you know, they debate both ways. Not all the issues of compliance and ethics deal with legal matters.
Yeah.
You're dealing with a code of conduct. You're dealing with industry standards. You're dealing with issues of, working on a policy manual, making sure that you're dealing with a whistleblowing program. Good example. Lawyers they get involved when the issue, becomes serious, but they're not going to be involved in someone smoking in the bathroom.
So you think they're separate departments, ultimately?
I don't know. I will leave it up to you. You're the next generation. But I've seen it pro and con. So, but right now it is part of the legal function. Yes.
So that brings up the question: do you believe that things can be legal but also unethical? And where would you draw that line?
Sure, you can have. You can certainly have lawyers who are really unethical. Violate law, for whatever reason. That certainly is not unusual. Can something be legal and still be unethical? Yeah, I think so. I think to the extent of how you interpret the law, and I think I don't have an easy answer for you, but my gut tells me that, do you have an example that?
Offhand, I'm not sure, but for example, we already talked about offshoring. A lot of those practices are legal, but some people might have moral qualms with the practices within Chinese factories and the way that they treat their employees, even though it's legal both in China and in the U.S.
Yeah. As far as a lawyer would be concerned, was the contract properly drawn up? Have there been any charges brought against the contractor? Have we been cited by, international organizations for employing people in fairly horrific organizations? In the narrowest sense, it's legal.
Yeah.
But the question is, and this gets back to the very essence of the organization, is this the organization's moral standards and real integrity? And to the extent that a lawyer will say, I can write a contract. We'll write a contract, and and as long as it doesn't violate U.S. law or state law, we can do anything we want, But the question is, in doing that, given the fact that it doesn't necessarily violate U.S. or state law practice, is what we want to do the right thing to do? And if, for example, I can write a contract, we're going to go into some product area that, people may think of a product area that people would think of as...
Gardening?
I'm sorry?
Gardening?
Gardening?
Yeah.
Okay, you can go into gardening. You can do it. You can go in... give you a good example. Where I live, up in Vermont, someone purchased property near us, and they're opening a cannabis growing operation. Legally, it's fine. The lawyers can draw the contract. There's nothing. What has raised an issue, and it's not even growing marijuana. The issue is, putting this facility into a relatively residential area. but the question is, you may not like marijuana. And to the extent that you want to go into that area, it's legal in so many states. Other states, it may not be. So you say, okay, I want to open up a cannabis facility. I'm based in Minnesota or something, and I'm going to open up a cannabis facility in Vermont. The lawyers can draw up all the contracts, make sure that it's absolutely fine. It doesn't violate Vermont law, whatever. But is it something I want to do? I mean, it may not be illegal, but it may be an issue of ethics. It's an issue of is this what we want to do? Mm-hmm. Is this how we want to conduct our business?
Right.
And I think, and this is a case where, and I think probably as a lawyer would have they'll draw up the contract. It'd be perfectly fine. But they're working on behalf of a corporation or an institution. And to the extent that they may say, I don't think we should be doing this, which is perfectly legitimate. On the other hand, the corporation will say to them, who are you? We're not paying you to tell us how to market our product or how we should go into a new market area. I'm paying you to draw up a contract, make sure we don't get sued, we don't have the feds or the state on our back, and just leave it at that. I'll take care of the rest. Or if the shareholders are going to scream, they're not going to scream at you. They'll scream at me as the head of the organization. Mm-hmm. So I think it's to your case to where it may not be illegal, but you run into these ethical issues.
Yeah.
And then it really begs the question, do laws create ethics or do ethics create laws?
It's a combination of both. I think to the extent of what are our ethics are in essence a moral compass. As we said before, it is what we believe in as based on our religion, culture, to the extent that laws they do get codified on the basis of our own beliefs. I mean, it is the guidance for it. The question is, who's doing this codification of our ethics? Mm-hmm. I mean, look at what's going on now in this country, whether you're talking about abortion, whether, transgender rights and things like that. I think to the extent that, what are our ethical values that we want to have, in this case, state attorney generals running after medical records for someone who's seeking advice or guidance, or someone who lives in one state and has an abortion in another state where it is permitted, and yet you want those records. And I think to the extent that how our values do get translated into law, and it's interesting. I think I'm not sure about law creating. Do you think the law? Oh, let me ask you guys.
Okay.
Enough of my chatting. Do you think law creates ethics?
I think that ultimately ethics come first as a moral compass, yes. Right. And then laws follow that. Right. But I should say I took inspiration from this question from Leviathan. So Hobbes said that humans desire to obtain as much power as they can, and as long as there are no laws preventing them from harming or killing others to attain what they desire. So I'm saying basically from like a basic perspective, if you erase society without written laws, then humans still have ethics and feelings. Yes. So personally, I think that ethics create laws.
Yeah. I agree 100%. I think it comes from within. And there's other influences besides the law, like your culture, your religion, that also impact how a person's moral compass works.
Yeah. Let me ask you a hypothetical question, since I've been chatting now for a while. What do you think about how to manage ethics and like compliance in organizations? What would, if someone gave you, David, you are the co-CE, you are the co-CCOs of the XYZ corporation. We're giving you carte blanche. You report, technically you're part of the legal office, but you have a dotted line relationship up to the CEO. What do you do? Where do you start? What is your framework?
Well, I think a lot of where change will happen is in terms of your hiring practices. So
Yes.
it would probably be important as screener questions to ask people certain moral questions to see where their compass lies. In your book, you talked about setting up the whistleblower programs and the hotline programs. I think that's very relevant. And I don't know, David, co-CEO.
No, I agree. I think that ultimately, laws and compliance programs can be written as thoroughly as you want, but if you have people working who are unethical, they'll always find a way to, wiggle around the compliance,
Right.
Find a way through it, do something that someone doesn't find out about. And we even were speaking about how Alan Greenspan said that
Right.
laws can't replace ethics.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the question that, and one of the frustrations that compliance has is you have no power to hire and fire. All you can do, you find some sleaze bucket who's operating somewhere in your world.
Mm-hmm.
You can't fire them. You can go to the management of this individual and say, XYZ is doing this, it's causing us risk. I think we should get rid of this person as quickly as possible. But what if the person says, I love him, he's great, he's bringing in all kinds of money, we have clients we've never had before, people love us.
Exactly.
Now, let me ask you, you are the chief compliance officers, and this is not unusual. It's like the guy who brought in the consultants who didn't want to do drug testing.
Mm-hmm.
And you say to them, hey, listen, you got to get rid of this guy. He's done something, he's doing something wrong. What do you do then? What is your next step?
Well, it's difficult. I think it's important to consider, I guess, the types of decisions that he's making, how far gone are they? Our first and primary responsibility is a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders. So, of course, we want to be making money,
Right.
but it's important to consider at what cost, and that's probably on a case-by-case basis. So if there's something that's, I think everybody has a certain level where it's like, you have to shut this down. This is super unethical. But there's a lot of moving parts there to consider.
And I think it comes down to if it's hurting you in the short term or
Right.
in the long run. So if you're covering something up and it creates a brief spike in revenue and your shareholders are happy, at the end of the day, do you know that when it comes out you're going to go bankrupt?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where you draw the line. If it's something that's I guess you're sort of skirting compliance a little bit, then maybe it is turning a blind eye to what works. And I think BlackBerry is a great example. So they are you familiar with what they did with their stock options?
No.
So what happened was they wanted the top engineers, so they backdated a lot of their stock options to pay them,
Right.
which is extremely illegal. The SEC got involved.
Right.
And that's one of the questions we wanted to ask you is, do you think that there's a point that you could do something slightly unethical to achieve the greater good? So, BlackBerry connected a nation at the cost of, technically by the books they did it incorrectly.
Right.
The answer is no. It will come back to haunt you. It will. And, matter of fact, that was a question I wanted to ask you guys. Where do you draw the line? And this gets to the issue of can something be a little unethical? Can you? I mean, and I think there is in this case there are certain circumstances in which people sometimes, the answer should be no. I mean, you have codes, this is how we behave. But there come times when, sometimes, I had somebody in one of my classes who was from Africa, and they were working on an issue regarding women in jail in their country. And they had a very difficult situation, and technically they had very strict rules in terms of how they want to deal with it, so they didn't antagonize the government, that type of thing. But this was a case where it was so horrific, and they violated their own rules to help this individual. Mm-hmm. And she goes, I understand, it was against the ethics of the organization, but we've just felt that the person, just being a human being, you cannot do it. I have a classic case for you guys.
Good.
Had a student from California, and he worked in a after-school program. And they got money from different sources to work with kids on like education, family issues. They did some sports, it was all kinds of programs. The director of the program routinely violated the admissions criteria for bringing in kids. Mm-hmm. He felt that the funding sources were much too stringent, and he was going to try to stretch things a little bit.
Right.
Mm-hmm. My student who worked in this thing really had questions about this. Mm-hmm. And let me pose, what do you think about this case of a man who routinely violated the admissions criteria for the kids to be serviced by this program? Was he acting, of his own personal volition? He felt obviously, personally, that they were not bringing in enough kids to be serviced. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, he is working for an organization that is getting paid, and they have criteria to meet. What do you think of a situation like this?
What were the admissions criteria?
I don't remember the exact ones, but that it was clear that they were rather narrow, and this guy felt that they were too narrow.
Right.
And
so they wanted to take more kids in.
Right, but he wasn't authorized to do it. Mm-hmm. He had no right to bring these kids in. And so he's putting the organization at risk. Would you, if you were in his shoes, what would you do?
I think best approach is, if what he wants to ultimately achieve is to have more students have access to the after-school programs.
Right.
He should first seek funding, and not spread the existing funding too thin. And then when he has enough funding, then he can expand the program. Otherwise, it's just irresponsible.
I agree, and I think if he wants change to happen, he should go to the board or whoever is responsible.
That was what I was going to ask you. If you're sitting on the board of this organization, mm-hmm. and you love the guy, he's a fabulous executive director. The kids love him, funding sources love him, but he's doing something illegal or certainly unethical, and in a sense of he's violating the contract that the organization has with these funding sources. Mm-hmm. What do you do with this guy?
Well, it's hard. I think it's always...
I know it's hard, that's why I'm asking.
It's always going to be a dilemma of business and morality, and whether you should mix the two or keep them separate. I think, of course, ethics is super important, like we've been talking about. As a board member, honestly, I think I would probably have to value more whether or not he's following the code of conduct that we have in place. And if he's not, then just objectively, you should not allow it to keep happening, even if you disagree with it morally, or if you believe that what he's doing is right.
I was a slightly different approach. I think that personally I agree with what he's doing, just in the way that you laid out the example. I have a bit of a soft spot for the guy. And I think that if he's bringing up an issue in this way, then it's the board's responsibility to, you know, seek more funding for the cause.
Well, it also depends if it's something that, let's say he's brought it up a few times before and it's been shut down, and then he goes out and decides to do it on his own.
Yeah.
That's another.
Well, it would seem to me, and I'm playing the,
Devil's advocate.
I'm the hard-ass board member.
Mm-hmm.
He's put the organization at risk.
Mm-hmm.
The funding sources are going to say, you know, hey, you violated, you know, the contract. You put at risk the kids who do legitimately meet the standards of the contract.
Mm-hmm.
You put at risk the various employees who are getting paid to deal with these kids who do meet the standard. How much risk was he willing to do, or risk willing to take, if, you know, that he does jeopardize the very integrity of the organization? And yes, I agree, you know, it would have been legitimate to go out and go find additional sources of money that would deal with these other kids who, you know, whatever. But I'm not sure about that. I just remember that my student telling me that this guy routinely violated it. And it just seemed to me, he's putting the organization at risk. You know, I understand, and listen, no one wants to see a kid who can't be serviced. I mean, I agree with you, Dave. On the other hand, you know, he's doing it in a way that there are repercussions to the organization. And maybe to him, that they fire him for having done it without telling the board. On the other hand, if he told the board, they'd probably say, you can't do it, you know. Mm-hmm. So, but these are the complex issues that people find.
Right.
It's like the guy in the corporation who, you know, is doing something, but his bosses love him because he's bringing in money and making us look great. And at what point do you say, you know, it gets back to issues here that have come up regarding sexual harassment. Somebody is, you know, they're a wonderful manager, and then, you know, the issues come up regarding their behavior. What do you do? And this is a classic compliance issue. How much sexual harassment is okay? I mean, how much harassment is okay before you say goodbye? On the other hand, the person is generating in all kinds of good things for the corporation, other than being a sleaze.
Right.
At what point do you, as being a compliance officer who has to raise this issue, and then you being the senior managers and then the board, what do you deal with this when you see them violating codes of conduct? And then what is more important?
I mean, comfort of employees in general, obviously it's not a one-man show, is definitely paramount. I personally believe that if a person who places money over, you know, just like upholding their ethics and their personal values, if he's disrespecting other people within the corporation, I think that's definitely more important than whatever revenue is generating. And I also believe in the principle of karma, so I do think it's going to come back to him. It's going to come back to the company in a bigger way. Yeah.
So you bring up good points, and I also want to make the point that for a company, the culture that you set within your organization is really what's most important. And you even brought this up in your book. You were talking about how the way that you respond to certain crises is going to define your reputation for a lot longer than any regulations and codes that you have in place that you might not be following. I think the same is true here. the way that you're able to make an example out of this person who's making people uncomfortable, even if he's making you money, those are the kinds of decisions
Sure.
that people will remember your organization for and say, wow, they do the right thing even if it's against their financial interests.
Yeah.
I'll give you a story. I guess I got lots of stories.
That's great.
That's what the podcast is here for.
I remember when I was at the bank, and I was out in California, someplace, and someone pulled me aside, a woman pulled me aside, and said, there's a manager there who had been accused of harassment, like she didn't go, it wasn't sexual, but it was clear that he was on the hot seat in terms of his behavior towards women. But she said he also got, but then ultimately they dropped the issue. But while he was on this hot seat, he got a bonus. He got a very substantial bonus.
Didn't you mention that in the book? Or
It may have been in the
a
book.
similar example, I don't know.
Yeah, that may be in the one in the book. And I probably, because it always reminded me that, as you know, the grapevine is very, everybody knows what everybody's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that they would give this person, this man, a bonus, and even though people were, a final decision hadn't been made in terms of his employment there. But it gets to your point, it is the reputation. I don't care if you're being a little sleazy, but like you did well for us last year, so we're going to give you whatever XYZ bonus. Not even hold off doing it till after whatever the charges or the incident was settled. But the idea was that, and she was so upset. How could they give him a bonus when people were so upset? And what does it say about the business? That you can be a sleaze, but you did well last year, and we're going to give you your bonus.
Wouldn't he be innocent until proven guilty, though, in this case?
Well, yes, technically it was. I guess the corporation felt, and again, I don't know, I didn't know any of the details of it, but I just remembered someone saying to me, yes, technically innocent. I mean, he was still an employee and he did whatever. But the idea that they couldn't even wait to give him the bonus after whatever the incident had been, so it would not appear, to your point, as if it doesn't make any difference. You earned money for us last year, you did a great job, here's your bonus.
Yeah.
And, you've got these harassment charges against you, we'll see how that works out. But then people knew. How could you give them a bonus? Yes, I agree with you, the issue of, innocent until, but still, it was a unfortunate way of dealing with it, I thought. But
Right.
that's why they pay others the really big bucks.
You're very well traveled.
But,
Well, you're very well traveled. There's stories in different cities and different hemispheres.
well, I was lucky. When I worked at cities, especially, I traveled the world for them. And then later on, got to meet other people. And in many ways, the issues really are universal. The issues of behavior, issues of codes, issues of how does one work to those codes, and try to live to it. The issues of, one of the questions I'll ask you, and I mentioned, I think I may have mentioned in the book, when you're looking for employment in a company, and you find some place, it's a little dicey, but it sounds fabulous. It's got a global reputation. The money is good, but you feel a little. how do you rationalize going to work for it?
Right. So this goes back a little bit, a question I was actually planning on asking you about how do we identify if there are baseline characteristics of what an ethical organization is. And from my perspective, I don't think that I would want to work for an organization that doesn't uphold the same moral values that I have, because constantly I feel like my time there, my conscience would be weighing on me, and I just don't think I would enjoy working somewhere where I feel almost uncomfortable with the culture that they have in place.
On the other hand, I'm going to play, I'll ask David, then I'll play devil's advocate here.
It's a difficult question.
Good, that's what I like.
I think it comes down ultimately to options. If you have, for example, a second salary that's slightly lower, but it puts you in a better position morally, I think it's better to take the slightly lower number. And then in the long term, like I said with karma, I think it'll come back to you.
Yeah.
But if it is your only option, then it's an issue. And that's kind of what I was getting at right when we began, when you spoke to that woman from Africa.
Right.
If she was, born into the situation where she has to, go against her own ethics just to make her way through, it's not somewhere that you would want to stay. But if it's inevitable, then you can't blame a person for making an unethical decision when you look at their options and there wasn't much else they could have done.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a difficult situation. You find a place, as I said, it's got a world-class reputation, it's fabulous, somebody, you tell them that you're working for them and their mouth opens, oh my God, the best and the brightest and blah, 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 blah. But, but people have a way of living with it. First of all, there's always rationalizations. Mm-hmm. I'm only going to be here for a year because I want it on my resume, or I have student loan. I have to pay. I need the money. It's good. Oh, or, it's real, and I've heard this before. This place really, it isn't me. I've heard this a dozen times. It's not really me. I go home and I'm a different person. I come here, or now I work at home, and I am the corporate type, but this place isn't really me. Mm-hmm. The question that I pose, who are you? That you have to play two roles. I'm not going to play this corporate game in this place, and when I get home, I'm a wonderful person. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's funny, a little bit of a story here. My brother, he went to the University of Connecticut, mm-hmm. and a lot of the engineers who went there actually end up receiving offers from arms dealers like Lockheed Martin, sure. And a lot of them are faced with that same decision of, do I want to work somewhere where maybe I feel a little bit uncomfortable with what we're doing? Yep. And even beyond that, I think in almost every industry where you're doing something, I guess, client-facing, you might have to pick between working for a client and appeasing what they want, even if it makes you uncomfortable, versus picking a different career path, sure. Maybe making less money, but you feel better. And David brings up a really good point where it comes down a lot to what kinds of options you have. Not everybody has a ton of career choices, and some people are forced into going down a certain route that...
Well, if you had potentially a couple of different jobs, just to say you had a couple of different choices, mm-hmm. and this is, and this one is, it is the, numero uno of the choices, in the sense of it's prestigious, it's blah, 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 blah. But this is not quite what I want to do. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting issue, and it's not even that they're manufacturing the atomic bombs or something.
That's what I was starting to think about the movie Oppenheimer.
Yeah. And so to the extent that, is this what I want to work for? Is this who I want to work for? And more importantly, is this who I want to work with? Mm-hmm. and and how much am I willing to degrade my own ethics and values for something on a resume, or for paying off a student loan, or for whatever benefit it would give you by working there. And these are real choices, and it's I don't and I think we're all faced with it, at some point. It's to your point of looking at criteria, getting back to your initial thing. Like, what is most important? Is it the salary, the opportunity to travel around the world? They're going to give you, a global position so you can work in X, Y, and Z. But this is not quite what I want to do the rest of my life.
Right.
So these are interesting challenges.
You lived on a caboose for a while?
Yeah.
And how long was it?
About 6 months.
6 months.
It was a weird experience. I had been traveling around the world, and I was in Fiji, of all places.
Mm-hmm.
And I met this young woman who was coming to LA, and I was going the other direction. Mm-hmm. And I got to talking to her, and I said to her, I'm going to wind up in Israel. And she, now again, this is 1976, a long time ago, preface it. And I said, I'm going to Israel. And she said, Jay, if you get there, there's this great kibbutz you may want to consider. So, yeah. So then later on my travels, I meet somebody else. And he also mentioned this place. Mm-hmm. So figured, I'll go. So I land in Tel Aviv, and I go over to Jerusalem, and I had the name of the political movement that ran the kibbutz.
Right.
And I go in there. It was on a Friday, and I said to them, "Yeah, I'd like to become a volunteer and work on the kibbutz." And the guy said, "You got to go now." I said, "Well, I just landed in Israel. I'd like to see Jerusalem. I may see Tel Aviv." "No, you go now or you don't go." And so it's called Hatzarim. It's outside of Beersheba. So I went down, and I thought maybe I'd spend, a couple of months, and it kind of stretched. But what was fascinating was that it was predominantly Spanish. It was the days, again, of Jacobo Timmerman about Argentina and the issues that were going on in Argentina. And so there were a lot of very affluent Jews in Argentina who sent their children to Israel to be safe. And so when you went into the kibbutz, the signs were all in Hebrew, English, and Spanish. And my wife and I went back about 10 years ago to visit it, and now it's all Russian. It's changed. But it was fascinating being on there. Again, this was, there were a lot of people who had survived the Holocaust. And it was, again, only 20 some odd years after 30 years after the Holocaust. So a lot of people, it was very fresh in their lives.
Was there something specific that you took out of your time in the kibbutz that you then applied to, compliance and ethics work?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. That is a very good question. I don't know. There was a sense, again, this was 76, so it was a while ago. Begin and like Sadat had not met yet. It was a while back. Well, there was always a sense of security that I took away from. But no, I think it was the issue of righteousness and people. What I took away from it were the issues of people who had survived the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. I spent my summers up in the Catskill Mountains from the late from like the mid 1940s till I was about 16, 17. And we had a number of people who had literally just come out of the camps, living up there and being there. And that to me was always the memories I have of these stories. And then when I went to Israel and working with people on the kibbutz who had numbers, and there and hearing their stories, you could not be not be influenced other than ethically by the horrors of what they experience and the total injustice of their lives and who they lost. So it was, in that respect, yes, it was a real experience for me.
Do you believe that the kibbutz model could be scalable to larger communities? And if so, why haven't we seen it be successful anywhere I live in Israel?
I think it was a legacy of the early times of the kibbutz, of the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, when Israel was, first coming.
It's formative.
I think it's outgrown its world. I mean, I don't know. I haven't been back in 10 years, so I can't tell. But it was an experience. All the kids lived separately. The parents. It was as a volunteer, I got paid in cigarettes.
Nice.
What were you doing there as a volunteer?
This was an interesting dilemma, since we were talking about dilemmas. They manufactured a drip irrigation system. The pipes that curl along the ground and water drips out at the base of each. And that is where they made their real money. That was the money maker. And then they had a refit, and they had fields out like in Ashkelon and things like that. But it was the factory. That was the real money maker. And the question is, did anybody want to come to a kibbutz to work in a factory? Mm-hmm. And it was, volunteers like me did it. So I worked in the factory. I washed dishes for several hundred people, one of my other jobs. But the thing that made my father proudest, I worked on the plumbing systems. And since my father was a plumber, I remember being down in the ground fixing some pipes or something. Mm-hmm. And I told him the story, and he was so thrilled that I was a plumber in the Holy Land.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it was an experience. But and then you did things like stack hay, all the odds and ends. But after a while, they asked me if I wanted to stay. But I was an American. My life was back in New York, in New Jersey, and so I thanked them. But it was time to move on and get back.
Do you think that you could have built this? You have a compliance consulting company. Do you think you could have built it up easily in a kibbutz model society, more directly in a communist society, or was it easier to do in a capitalistic society?
Oh, I think in a capitalistic society. I think, again, it deals with issues of reputation. It deals with, in the social capital, the whole structure is based on oversight. It's based on,
Ignore it.
Yeah, it is the very essence of what it is. That's why, for example, in some countries like France, and I think Russia also, but certainly France, at one point outlawed hotlines because they brought back memories of World War II and of people talking to the German Gestapo about people's behavior. And it had such, and I think it was Russia And I certainly know France did. And so I think to the extent, though, that many of the socialists, the very essence of oversight is built in. Whereas in the U.S., it's the fear of running afoul of like the law and having, and having the judiciary impose, the real requirements of what a good compliance function is for the organization. And I think, and people take it seriously. And I think, I don't think a compliance function would do well. But then again, who knows? I mean,
Yeah. I want to use this to bring up entrepreneurship, actually. So, for somebody right now who is an entrepreneur and is interested in starting a company,
right.
What role do you believe ethics should play in their decision-making process as they're starting up?
Well, I think you've got to be true to your own soul. I think to the extent of who am I going to take on in terms of being a client? Who do I want to work with? Who do I want to contract with? How do I want to, what's my reputation? What do I want to be seen as? Reputation is, when you destroy your reputation, you really kill yourself. And to the extent that if I'm starting out as a business, what do people want to think of me as or me for? And I think to the extent that, what are my values? What is important to me? Yes, we want to make money, and that's always important. But in doing that, how much am I willing to sacrifice? How much am I willing to put my own mouth where I want to be? And that whether it's going into a product line, whether it's hiring people, whether you're going to subcontract to an entity, are these people I want to be associated with?
Right.
I mean, and I think if you're going to be an entrepreneur, which I think is fabulous, these are the things that you have to think about. Listen, I remember, I'll tell you a story. I was doing some consulting for an organization in New York, which got a lot of good money. And I knew the executive director of it. And I was there, I was hired to write a guide for other organizations who wanted to replicate what they were doing because they were being so successful. Fine. And the executive director and I had known each other for a number of years before she left that previous job and got this new job as the head of this organization. And she hired me to write this. And about a month into the project, I'm leaving her building in Manhattan. And she turns around to me and says, "Where is mine?" And I said, "What do you mean, where is mine?" She says, "Everybody who does work for me has to give me something. So if you're a plumber, or if you were an AC guy, I expect you to give me some kind of AC as a kickback. These are all kickbacks." And she said to me, "I expect you're going to give me some money for me giving you this job."
Interesting.
And I thought this was a friend. This is the worst part. I thought this was, a colleague, a friend, someone I knew. And I'm in this position, and I could use the money. I was just starting off, and it was good dollars. It was prestigious. The funding source was a very, very famous place. And I'm standing on the stoop of this place as she's saying to me, "Where's mine?"
Right.
And I said to her, "Listen, I didn't know what to say." So I said, "Listen, I'll get back to you." I mean, that was the best that I could really do. And it's so rich, and I wrestled with this. And my father was a plumber, and I told him the story, and he said, "Oh, why don't you just pay her off? You know, it's the way business is done. Just pay her." I said, "I don't want to do that. I don't want to." I was thoroughly angry that she asked me for a kickback. B, she was asking me for money that I didn't have to kick back with. But it was the sense of my own ethics. Is this what I want to do? That, you know, I'm going to be a plumber and kick back to the person in order to get the job, or pay the plumbing inspector to leave me alone and let me go on with what I have to do. And so I was really in a dilemma, and about a week or two later, and the question that I had is that, should I tell the funding source that this woman is asking me for a kickback? And I figured, that may be problematic. You know, it may be raising more than I'm willing to risk.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually, I called. It was a woman. I called her up and I said, "Listen, I'm not going to work on it. You know, keep what I have. You can keep all my notes and stuff. I'll leave it with you. Goodbye. Give it to somebody else." But it was the thing about being put into that dilemma that, you know, it was, what do I do? And, but, you know, to your point about, is this how I want to run a business? I could have given her money.
Yeah.
You know, I had the money. And my father encouraged, said, "Listen, it's the way they do business. Do it, you know." But I said, "Dad, this is not how I want to start off my own career. I'm just not going to do it. I'm not going to pay kickbacks. I'm not going to pay kickbacks." And so, so I lost the contract.
Right. So that is interesting, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether we should hold smaller firms, and for example, we talked about entrepreneurship, starting up your own business. Do you believe that you should be held to the same regulatory standards as industry leaders? So for example, Sarbanes-Oxley led to increased accounting costs, auditing costs, other general costs. Is it fair for everyone to be subject to those same rules? Or should we cut some slack to the new guys?
Yeah, I think you should be held to the same standards. They don't make a distinction between, you know, if you're in the public sector and you're making money, you're paying taxes, I think you should be held to the same standards. Because one day you're going to be a big macher, and you're going to suddenly say, "Now I have to adhere to these standards."
Mm-hmm.
Do it when you're small. You will not lose anything. It becomes a practice and a policy.
Mm-hmm.
And when you bring in people to work in your world, this is how we do business. It's the law. We're going to manage it. We may not like it. It may cost us money. And Citibank used to have an interesting thing. They had a hiring office at Citicorp Center. And they had a sign. When you walked in, Citibank does drug testing. We do criminal history background checks. I forgot the other thing. But it was kind of like, if you don't like it, please turn around and go home, or go find employment someplace else. And I think to your question, yes, it does impose, you know, a burden on you. On the other hand, you know, better to do it now and build it into how you want to do business and manage it. Not easy, but I think it's, in the long run, it's the value that you will accumulate.
Interesting. And we were speaking about censorship under communism, and we're also the children of parents who were raised in communist societies.
Yeah.
And something that stands out to us, I think you as well, they always speak about how they were sort of worried about saying something or expressing an opinion that they feared others would disagree with. Do you feel like that's becoming an issue in America today? And if so, do you feel that certain compliance and ethics practices, maybe even ESG investing, is playing into that?
Well, we live in a different world today. We live in a world of, blogs. We live in a world of social media. We live in a world where information is so widely dispersed in seconds. The things that, years ago you wouldn't know about for weeks or days, now you know within minutes and seconds. I mean, we are, and I think I'm sorry, can you just get back to the question?
What do you mean, like to repeat it?
Yeah.
Of course. So I was saying that we were worried about our parents being worried about censorship.
Right.
Do you feel that that's becoming an issue in America today, specifically through like social media companies censoring certain posts, or maybe even rules that ethics departments create within corporations?
It is a risk. I think we live in such a polarized world that I think people are afraid, that somehow somebody says something and it becomes such a media event that I think people are concerned. On the other hand, it's so easy to really tell the world what you believe, and just understanding by really expressing it, you do run a risk. I mean, it's yes, it's not censorship as it was back in the communist world. And here you have the freedom to do whatever you want. But there is no such thing as having information dissemination without risk. I mean, there's always there's a consequence for it. You may just blow it off and say, who cares? It's what they say, whoever they are. But yes, I think it should not be a barrier. I think, you run the risk. You teach, there's there've been some interesting stories about teachers who have been bringing up topics in the classroom. And, and suddenly now they are being labeled as being, horrific people.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, if you believe in really freedom of speech, you believe in, obviously you can't say fire in a movie theater. But if I'm a teacher, am I going to censor myself? Because here's a topic I think people are going to be upset about. And especially in the cases that I heard where they had warned people, they were going to raise the issue. It wasn't come out of the blue. But I do believe, yes, that you have a responsibility. And I think people do have the freedom to do it. But understand, there may be consequences for it. But it is such a different world we live in. We laughed about Fortran a while back. Here anybody can set up a program now, AI systems. I mean, it is amazing to me. It is such a different world. When we have grandchildren who are 7, 6, 5. They're all computer literate. They're all, it is amazing to me. And it is fascinating where this world is going. But it is complicated, as we've talked about. And the issues of regulation, issues of feedback, the issues of feeling, is there reciprocity for what I'm saying? You know?
Interesting.
So,
Go ahead.
David brought up ESG, and I'm curious, in your experience working with corporations, how often do the, I guess, charitable or seemingly moral acts that they do are truly they're doing it out of the kindness of their heart or to do good versus trying to virtue signal or boost their reputation or for some other ESG score reasons? Like,
Well,
how
again,
often do we see that?
when I left before ESG became this topic.
But still kind of very similar work.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, City had a very large charitable organization. Other people have too, and it's mixed. I mean, some do it because they think it's the right thing to do. Others, let's get real. It looks good.
Yeah.
You know, it's mom and apple pie. You know, suddenly the XYZ Corporation is supporting, you know, Black Lives Matter, or, you know, transgender rights,
Yes.
or we're not going to be, you know, we're only recycling certain things and we're not recycling others. It's done for a mix. Some cases, the CEO wants to make sure that whatever dollars they're doing is going to be approved. Others, they let lower level staff do it. But it's always a combination of righteousness and business.
Right.
I mean, let us get real. But I think sometimes, you know, but this is a classic case. A corporation gives you money. There's still a sense of responsibility to it. You know, it's not just let's use the money and do some silly thing with it. You know, you do have a responsibility to really the grantee,
Right.
the grantor, and to the extent that it gets back to what we talked about a while ago. You know, I may want to work in a charitable organization and I want to help people and, you know, whatever. But you still have to be responsible for the funds that are giving you the opportunity to do this. It's not a matter, I don't want to be a bureaucrat. And it's not a matter, I don't want to hold myself to the organization's values, its code of conduct, the laws and regulations in which it governs how we do business. You just can't blow it off. It's impossible. You can blow it off, but it's risky.
It'll come back.
I'm sorry.
It'll come back to you.
Oh, it will come back to you in a nanosecond. And they'll say, in essence, David, what are we giving you money for? If you can't manage it appropriately, there are 1,000 other people who would love to have our dollar, who can manage it much more effectively, who feel the same way you do and want to help people and God and charity and whatever, but are more responsible and have a sense of, I wouldn't say loyalty to the funding source, but at least a sense of obligation. And we live in a world where you have to be responsible for that. There is no such thing as a free lunch.
Yeah.
That's true. How do you see ethics playing into artificial intelligence?
I don't know enough about AI. Honestly, I struggle with it to understand it. So maybe a year from now, you know, I struggle with understanding artificial intelligence.
Right.
I have to say, it's something that I try to master.
Right.
Well, were you telling me that OpenAI was doing?
Yeah, so recently Google created an ethics committee they have their own AI, Google Bard.
Right.
And one of the practices that they had, and a big dilemma for them, is making sure that the responses AI is giving out are ethical as well. So you want to avoid hate speech, racism, anything like that. And what they did was they hired people in Kenya to check the AI responses. This is for ChatGPT, now
Yeah.
that I'm talking about, for hate speech, and they were actually employing those people at less than $2 an hour. So it comes down to they're trying to do something ethical on one end, and then they're also participating in practices that by a lot of people would be deemed wrong.
Well, I'm gonna put on my corporate hat.
Okay.
Maybe $1.85 is a decent wage in Kenya.
Right.
Maybe they're not screwing them. Maybe it is considered a reasonable salary. Now, that's my corporate hat. Paying them $2 an hour or whatever the rate is. It's no different than organizations who used to bring in years ago technology people from like India.
Yes.
They would bring them in because they were knowledgeable, they were good, and they were cheap. Was that wrong? Giving them employment in the U.S. Was that unethical?
It depends how they're compensating them. Were they paying them below minimum wage? In this case?
No. They were paying them fair. They were paying them a decent wage. No. They were not. No, this was not slave labor wages.
Mm-hmm.
No, they were paying them. But the thing is that they were still cheaper than if you hired an American citizen, probably at the time. They were still less expensive. But the question is, was that a right thing to do?
Well, I think it comes down to cost of living relative to where the person is working. So if in Beijing, a bottle of water costs 25 cents in America,
Right.
it costs $1, then those are things that it does make sense. So we hear $4 an hour in New York,
Yes.
then that's unlivable. But in
Right.
Beijing, or like we said in Kenya, maybe that is.
I could not imagine a company such as Google doing something so stupid as to, to employ someone dealing with like issues of ethics and violating the very principle
Right.
of how you treat somebody. In this case, giving them minimal, wages.
Yeah.
It would be, that's the type of thing that the companies do, and that what gets them into serious trouble. On one hand, you talk about God and country and all these righteous things, and then you go and you employ someone, or you treat them terribly, or you fire everybody in the country and you go to some other country where you can get their labor for a pittance, and maybe under working conditions that are less than human.
Does religion play into your thought process when you're coming up with compliance policies?
No.
No, it's purely personal.
Well, I'm not a good Jew in that way. My wife is much more religious than I do. I know, and religion only in the sense that my father's had a horrific childhood in the Ukraine, in the shtetl, because of his religion. He and his family. They were rescued in their childhood. And so, I don't deny, it's not the religious teachings that I don't, but it's the sense of being a Jew and knowing what it's like, growing up surrounded by Holocaust survivors because of their religion. Having family and friends and relatives who are very conscious of being Jewish, and I think to the extent of it, you cannot ignore it. People have worked in under terrible conditions, and now would dread that their children ever have to work in a similar fashion. So I think, yes, religion in that way, not the tenets of necessarily a sitter or something.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Even though I did go to Hebrew school for many years, but
yeah, so just to circle back a little bit to what we were talking about with offshoring, I'm curious, do you believe that American corporations should feel some kind of responsibility to keep jobs in America?
it's an interesting question. They should keep where it's economically feasible, where it makes sense. I think that they should. If I feel sorry for a lot of companies who were working in, or a lot of communities where a company was working there for years and years, and they were the principal employer, and they suddenly close up and they go to some other country because it's simply economically much more feasible. It's simply too expensive keeping it going. So I think the U.S. I think U.S. employers do have some degree, but it ultimately comes down to money. I mean, to what you see it comes down more than just money. I'm going to backtrack. What do you see as your role in this world? Yes, money is important. I'm not minimizing it, but are you a member of a, quote, community? Do you play a role there? Is it something that you feel that it's very important? And it gets to another issue, and I know I'm kind of wandering off of your question.
It's fine.
It gets to the issue of loyalty. What do you see as being your loyalty to U.S. employees, U.S. population? What do you see as loyalty to the people who work for you? What do you see as a quote employee in sense of being loyal to the organization who employs you? And so in sense of is loyalty, I mean, if I have a factory in, XYZ, Iowa, and I can do that same function in another country at a tenth the cost of what it maintains, what is my loyalty to that community? Or would these people, if somebody else opened a factory nearby who offered better salary and benefits, would they jump to them? Mm-hmm. How loyal would they be to me as being this employer if there was competition to it? But there's a sense of loyalty. And I think, funny, we were talking about this, we had family over the other night, and we talked about loyalty and how the concept of loyalty has changed in organizations. And it deals with issues of ethics and integrity, and how certainly it has changed enormously, and especially when you hire people as consultants, temps, when you outsource. What is their loyalty to the company? On the other hand, what is the company's loyalty to their employees when they can get rid of them and go ahead and hire a temp, a consulting company who would be much less expensive, mm-hmm. and does not feel the sense of commitment that you have. And so it gets back to the issue of commitment, loyalty. I mean, hopefully, if you can get people in the States who can give you that same quality job at the same cost, why not keep it here?
Yeah. So loyalty, I think, is super interesting when it comes to corporations because we've seen a ton of different types of employment models be implemented. Mm-hmm. Notably, I want to bring up in Japan, what's common there is their contract model, where essentially instead of employment at will, which we see a lot in America, where
Right.
you could quit at any time, be fired at any time,
Right.
there you typically would sign a contract for, let's say, 3 years, and a lot of people end up staying at the same company for almost their entire lifetimes. Do you feel that that's a more effective model, and think that maybe more businesses should try implementing that?
Well, we had it in the States in many ways. It used to be that people looked upon their employer as a lifetime experience. It wasn't, you didn't jump from job to job to job, or employer to employer. You know, you stayed with them for a long time. You didn't have a formal contract. And they have contracts in Europe, they have contracts in Africa. It was always a sense of commitment. You know, I worked for XYZ. I am part of that world. I'm part of the family, you know, whatever. But things have changed in the 1990s and 2000s and it cut both ways. Businesses were willing to lay off employees when they felt that they were too expensive. It was cutting in on profit. Employees in turn were willing to jump ship, especially with certainly in younger world, when the .com organizations, everybody was running.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I worked at Citibank, a number of people, all desperate to go work for a .com company in 1999, 1998. And it wasn't for salary, it was for stock, with the idea that you become a billionaire.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when this little entrepreneurial venture takes off, and I'm going to be rich. And then, of course, 2 years later, things kind of busted and they came back to the corporation. But the idea was that the corporations did not feel like they were, it wasn't the sense of family. It was a business. And you did the work, we love you, we'll pay you, we'll compensate you, but if we don't need you, we're gonna get rid of you. That's the same as like an employee. I'm not getting paid, I'm not getting respected. You know, I have somebody else who will give me a better deal. I'll get, not only will I get a bonus and salary, but I'll also get stock options. Why am I staying here for when I can go there and I have a better future? This is not, but it's a different world. Things have changed. When I joined Citibank back in the 80s, there were people who, this was their life employment. This is, you know, you were there 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. I mean, this was your life. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, it's a radically different environment. I mean, would you ever think of staying at a company for 25, 30 years?
Well, for me, it's funny. Both of my parents have been at their respective companies for over 20 years.
Okay.
Like, since they started there, they never left.
Right.
But
I'm not talking about you.
Yes.
For
me,
this is your generation.
Right. So I think when it comes to loyalty, it's a two-way street. So if I'm at a company where I feel like I'm constantly seeing outside hires come in with maybe even less experience than me but are getting promoted over me.
Sure.
And I feel, oh, my position is constantly at risk, I could get fired at any time. There's no reason for me to be loyal to that corporation.
Right.
Good point.
But if there's a place where I feel valued and respected and I feel like I'm being compensated fairly, I'm being promoted fairly, I'm getting the type of job I want to do, there's realistically no reason for me to leave. But yeah, I mean, clearly in this current generation, job hopping is super common, especially in software engineering and finance.
Sure.
Every couple years, I feel like I see people leave their company and jump up to get a new role elsewhere.
Because they like to leverage their salaries.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I mean, you know, it's interesting. Again, I'm more of your grandparents' generation, not your mother and father's. But you know, the idea is that you went to work for an entity and you worked for them. You know, if you left only if, yeah, obviously there was a fabulous offer had come along, and you wanted something that was going to be terrific. But now there is a generation where it is, you leverage what you make, and there's no inkling that you're going to be there 25 years or 20 years. Well, you'll work there as long as they can use you, and as long as they need you, until another opportunity comes along, and you will, grab that. It doesn't mean that you're going to leave after a year or two. You stay, you build up your skills and your knowledge, you make your contacts, you do your networking, all the good things. But I think, but I don't think there's a sense of, this is my family, it is my employer.
So that has left corporations now?
I think so. Yeah, I think, people still want to stay and, they want to make a good living and whatever. But it used to be like, this was it was like a family.
Right.
Which is another question I want to ask you guys, if you have patience.
We like questions.
Yeah.
What would you do? You have a colleague who's asleep. We talked about, we talked about something like a whistleblowing, whatever.
Yeah. Right.
But how do you manage it? This is the issue of, and we talked about this before. When do you look away? When do you report the individual? When do you say, I'm working with this guy, but he has another job. He's doing consulting, and he's taking what we've learned here, and he's bringing it over there. At what point do you say,
So
I know that we talked about this earlier, but
Right.
I want to just bring it, because it gets to the issues of loyalty, it gets to issues of job hopping, issues of taking knowledge that you've gained from one place and selling it in essence to somebody else.
So I think, of course, with certain kind of knick-knack issues, like I probably wouldn't involve myself. For example, if they've been making personal phone calls or they take an extra long lunch break, there it's none of my business. I don't really care. If it's something where I feel like it's putting the corporation itself at harm or affecting other people in poor ways.
Right.
If, for example, let's say I'm working with somebody in a group setting and they're never pulling their own weight, they're always distracted by other things, then maybe I speak to somebody at HR. But yeah, I think that's probably where I would draw the line.
I agree with what you said. I also want to add that you can't be loyal in two places at the same time.
Yeah.
So like you were saying, you're doing work with one company, and then like maybe you're bringing clients over to another place. I'll give you an example. In the gym downstairs, we have personal trainers, right? Sometimes they speak to clients in the gym, and then they take them out of the gym. That way, they get the full profit instead of having to split it. That's where you walk a very fine line.
Yeah.
And like I said, you can't be loyal in two places, and at that point, I think a person has to choose, I have to be either here or there. And personally, I don't know if I would, I would go to HR or report something like that. I would just stay in my own lane, I guess.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question, all about a gym. And this, don't even take downstairs as an example, but say there is a gym, and I have a contract with the gym, and I provide, the physical training for people. And the gym says, or the employer says, whatever relationship you make here stays here. You don't bring it home and charge them another thing. But you see people, in this case, theoretically, hypothetically, who are taking people home or work with them, and they're not splitting the money with their employer, which is the way they even got to know these people in the first place. They would never have even made the contact. What do you say, or do you say anything? where you just let it go?
Not my issue. Let it go.
Yeah,
Let it go.
I agree. I think a lot of times it probably also depends, like the work environment at the gym. Do we feel like it's a family environment, or is it just I'm not really concerned with what anyone else is doing,
Yeah.
as long as I'm getting my however much an hour, I'll just mind my own business.
It's an interesting issue, when do you say or not say something? Like, when is it something that I just, that is their problem, it's not mine, and I'm not gonna raise the issue. But,
I was gonna say if it becomes directly harmful to a person. So
Yeah.
if we take the gym example, if there's a new trainer starting out and there's someone else who's taking clients away from them
right,
and they're harming another person, that becomes an issue. But if they're working with someone and they take them off to the side, I can't say anything. However, if it becomes a case where they're taking someone's livelihood away from them, then I'd probably step up. I don't know about senior management, but intervene somehow in the situation.
but what if you're working in an organization, we have a colleague, and they are using, on the outside, they're taking the knowledge, taking the experience, taking maybe even client contacts to this other place that they're doing, consulting with or for. At what point do you say, let it be, or when does it get to be enough of an issue that it really does look sleazy? That they are stealing, in essence, they are stealing from the organization you're working for by taking that knowledge, taking maybe the clients, taking computer equipment, God knows what with them, and working off on the side someplace. Now, technically, it's not impacting you, but this is going on.
Yeah.
And these are the difficult questions of when do you raise it as an issue? Do you confront the individual and say, listen, what you're doing is really a problem. I'm not saying anything to anybody, but this is really a problem. Or do you go to the person's manager and say, listen, I think we have a problem here. On the other hand, it's not affecting you directly. It's your own ethics and your own values that you have to decide. When do you?
So I think what makes it difficult with corporations is it's a little bit hard to pinpoint who's actually the one being harmed, because there's so many different employees and it's not really necessarily taking money out of the CEO's pocket. Obviously, there are certain limits where it could be too far gone. Like,
Right.
it's seriously, I'm noticing something bad going on. But I think it's very different to an environment where, if let's say somebody is a cashier in like a small business, and I see them like stealing like a couple dollars from the cash register every time they're working it. It's a very different feel for me, and it makes the ethical dilemmas like on a completely different scale.
No, I agree. If it's something more direct like that, then it's more of a call to action.
Yeah.
But this is a very fine line that we're walking here in terms of bringing clients somewhere else.
Yeah. I'm just saying, it's not just bringing clients. It could be that they're using organizational equipment, or they're using, things that technically should not be used by anybody else outside of the organization. And because this individual has access to it, is now bringing it with him or her to this other place. And, it does become difficult. And especially for the person who knows about it.
Yeah.
And at what point do you say, I don't, when does it become serious enough that you feel that, or it's just wrong? There are things that are simply wrong, and based on your own ethical values, and to say, that's really just a sleazy thing they're doing. And, and yet, I guess part of it is that why hasn't anybody else in the organization know about this? Or are they like me looking the other way because they don't want a problem with this individual? Or nobody cares. Let them do it. They're not harming us. Let them do it. And this is where you find yourself in a real dilemma. This is what happens when you're awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, knowing, we've got this situation here. I don't know what to do.
And sometimes you lose a little bit on both sides when you make a decision.
It's never perfect. This is when, you talk to somebody else, whoever you may choose to talk, just to get someone else's opinion, and theirs may be diametrically opposed to yours, or they may be just in the same bag as you.
Right.
Gray areas are very common. It's like there are no, like we talked about earlier, there are no specific rules like in the Constitution about smoking or any, these are all gray areas where it's not regulated. And it's the question of where do you impose your own values and what you think is right and wrong. And again, you sometimes do have to look the other way. You just can't listen. There are some things that are just not worth getting into,
Do you think that the way a person behaves in these gray areas is what sort of defines their outcome in a theoretical afterlife?
Afterlife?
Yeah. If you believe in something like that.
I don't know. I don't know. Well, I just came back to the issue of the woman who asked me for a kickback.
Yes.
I felt I never reported her, which maybe I should have. I felt bad because I didn't report to the funding source that was giving her this money that she was paying me, that she wanted me to kick back the money on. So would this person who's rather sleazy wind up going somewhere other than, heaven or something? Who knows? I don't know. But it's a question of how can you live with yourself? The thing is, and you'll see this in organizations or everywhere. The famous words, everybody does it, everyone is doing it.
Right.
Everybody does it.
In school as well, not just organizations.
I'm sorry?
In schools as well, universities.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Everybody's doing it. It's sleazy, it's unethical, it may be immoral. Well, but everybody does it. You just kind of look the other way. And then the question is, if you decide, well, I'm not going to do it, am I willing to be the person who's going to call this? And everybody then saying, sure, David's a rat. Everybody was doing it. No one ever complained. It's the way that things have been done for 100 years. Now, who made you God and decided that this is not the way that it should be done? And I've heard this expression, from people. It's the way everybody does it. Why are you raising a problem when there is no problem?
Yeah.
And why don't you just go on your way and just let things be? Even though in your heart this is not right. Or maybe your gut tells you this is not the way it should be. But when are you willing to really make a stand and say, I don't care if everybody's doing it. We have to, this has to come to a halt at some point. So, yeah, these are the wonderful dilemmas.
It's interesting. So now that we're on the topic of schools, I kind of want to bring up a recent development in the, I guess, schools field, which was, the Supreme Court ruling against affirmative action.
Oh, yeah.
But I kind of want to put a bit of a corporate spin on this.
Sure.
How do you believe that it's going to impact hiring policies in the future and promotional policies as well?
In what way?
Well, if before affirmative action was a determining factor to an extent of whether somebody was being hired or promoted, and now that policy is gone.
I think you would hire them based on their skills and knowledge, and their capability of doing the job. Are you saying because if somebody went to Harvard because they were a minority, and that therefore as a corporation I'm not going to look to employ them?
No, I mean,
I'm just trying to understand the basis
more
of
so
your-
like certain corporations might have certain programs for example, I know on Wall Street there's a big push of employing or making an effort to employ more minorities or people from disadvantaged backgrounds. I'm
Right.
curious if you believe that affirmative action being overturned would have any kind of impact on that.
Oh, I don't know. Every corporation has to decide for itself how it wants to manage its employment and people who they do. If a corporation believes they want to give somebody an opportunity who they think is good and they never had a chance to use it, yeah, why not? I don't see corporations, standing in for universities or schools. I mean, that's not.
It does create a bit of a precedent, though. When we think about admission into universities, if now it's not allowed to be based on your skin color or
Right.
sexual orientation and stuff like that, does that create a precedent for employers who are now not allowed to make decisions based on a person's skin color or their sexual orientation or any other factor like that?
Oh, you couldn't. Yeah, I mean, you can only base it. You can only hire someone, based on their experience, knowledge, skills, skin color, religion, ethnicity should never have been an issue. It's always been based on. I mean, we have equal employment opportunity laws. It should only be based on whatever skills that and things that they can bring to the organization. If they're white, brown, pink, yellow, who cares? No one ever cared. It was to the extent of, can you make this place work better?
Yeah.
Can you help us do what we need to do in a much more efficient and effective way? And it never really, listen, if somebody's the daughter or granddaughter of maybe of some kind of celebrity, and you're working in a marketing place, maybe you would want those contacts.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, but that's few and far between. When you hire someone, you're hiring them based on their knowledge and their personality. If the person is a complete jerk off, pardon the expression, why would you? Even though they may be brilliant, unless you want to put them in a corner someplace and just program and just do coding and come up with AI for us and never talk to anybody else in the organization, fine. But that's not going to happen.
Interesting. I think we're kind of ready to wrap up, I guess.
Well, but before we wrap up,
And I have some few
I
smaller
can't
questions.
believe this has been 3 hours already.
Has it? I actually want to check if the cameras are still rolling.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that would be.
Are you keeping track of time?
Well, I just know it's 6 o'clock. We started at 3.
Yeah.
Other than that, so what do you do? Then you edit it down?
Yeah, then we don't really do too much editing for longer form podcasts. Like last week we filmed something that was over an hour long and we didn't have to.
Am I the longest one you've had?
Well, you're our first interview. Yeah, we haven't gone longer than an hour before.
Oh my God! I hope I am a role model that.
You've been a great guest.
I'm delighted you guys have me.
This phone died. I'm not sure when it happened, but the battery. Hopefully it wasn't halfway through the interview.
Yeah.
This one's still rolling.
That's good.
Okay.
Yeah, this one's good.
Okay, that's fine.
Dave, go ahead, ask that final question. I'm just gonna get this one.
Yeah. So the last thing that I guess I wanted to
Sure.
get your opinion on was insider trading within Congress. So
Yeah.
recently, I mean, I guess this has been around for a while actually. Accusations that members of Congress purchase individual stocks, securities, commodities, and not only do they do this personally, but they might do this through other members of their family. So I'm curious, how far do you think insider trading regulation should extend? Should it just be immediate family, or do we go as far as cousins and?
Everybody draws. When I worked at Citibank, there were very stringent requirements regarding trading stock purchase because we knew about, things that were coming down the pike, potential things. And so I had to sign an agreement that whatever I did or my family, now I don't remember who qualified as family or what was defined as family, but I do remember that I could not do any trading unless I went through the corporation.
Right.
To make sure there was nothing that smacked of insider trading. And yes, I have to tell you, even in the Congo, I was been writing policies for them, and that is one of the policies about you can't be doing things without and giving your family a real unfair advantage to it. But yes, I definitely think that Congress should be really tough on that. It just smacks of, making money illegally. I mean, it's just such a sleazy thing, and using a cousin, a brother-in-law, an uncle.
And we saw that happen a lot, especially leading up to the 2008 crisis, where members of Congress who were privy to certain secrets, they told their brothers or their wives or whoever to make certain stock decisions, and they were profiting while everybody else.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, and I think it's obviously people who vote them in should be voting them out.
Yeah.
If you're willing to tolerate, you talk about ethical behavior. If you're willing to tolerate that type of ethics on behalf of of one of your, elected officials,
right?
Good for you. I mean, it tells you. But no, absolutely, there should be stringent. It's done in private industry. Why would Congress be any different? Or even the Supreme Court? Why should they not have the same stringent regulations for governing their own behavior? I agree with you. It should be a very, very stringent thing.
Yeah, corruption among politicians is even super relevant now, especially with what's going on with Hunter Biden, which is all over the news. But in general, I do want to hear your take on how ethical is it for people to be career politicians? That, for
Nothing
example,
wrong with it.
a lot of people get criticism, especially if they're running for example, president, where if they never worked, actual jobs that don't involve being, for example, a member of, holding a political position.
Well, first of all, it's electorate. It's the person's, constituents who have to hold them to it. I think to the extent if the person has been doing a good job, they are responsive to their own constituents in terms of what they do. They're there to be available. I don't see that as being a problem. I think what happens is that it can become corruptible. Lobbyists look after them. But I really do believe there's nothing wrong with being a lifetime employee. Again, you're subject, if you're in Congress every 2 years,
Right.
if you're in the Senate every 6 years. So if they feel that you are being there too long, they'll vote you out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not your choice in that way. It's up to the people.
And I've been dying to hear your opinion on this. So the book was published in 2008, and you didn't speak much about the meltdown, the recession that occurred in 2008. Do you think that more effective compliance programs could have prevented 2008?
Mean the whole stock market?
Mm-hmm. Since it was caused by unethical banking practices at the end of the day.
Well, I'm not sure. The focus of the book, yeah, I wrote it actually in 2007. It was, but it came out later. No, I can't say. I'd lie to you to say otherwise.
Interesting.
Right. So I guess now we can kind of transition to what we had in mind for the final part of the interview, where we'd ask you more general or life-related questions. So I'll bring one up.
I just want to get some water.
Okay.
Of course, I'll grab it for you.
Okay.
It's in the refrigerator.
So I want to kind of get it started by asking you, throughout your career and your life in general, what in particular, if anything, do you feel has motivated you through the entire time?
Interesting. It's an adventure. I've often told my students that life is like going down a river. And it's an adventure. I never would have thought that I wind up doing what I'm doing, or what I have done when I started school. I was a pharmacy major. I mean, it never. The funniest story, when I was in high school, I spoke to my high school guidance counselor, and he asked me about my career aspirations. And I said to him, I wanted to be an archaeologist. And he goes, that's an educated ditch digger. What do you want to be an archaeologist for? And that kind of put the kibosh on that. But when I started school, I wanted to be, it's going to be fun. And then I realized it wasn't for me. It just was not. The courses, the thing, it just wasn't. And so I decided just to go with whatever I liked doing. And so, but one thing kind of melded into something else. So, getting a master's degree in public administration, and then teaching at Temple, and then meeting a cousin who knew somebody. Part of it is almost serendipitous, I have to say. The people you meet, you never know. Someone you meet, someone talks and says, gee, I know somebody who's doing this. Maybe you want to talk to them. Mm-hmm. But a willingness to say, you know what, I'll talk to them. I'll take a chance. I'll do it. And I think you leave yourself open to really take a chance. As I said, I wandered the world for a couple of years. My parents were horrified. I mean, like, how could you do this? How could you? I said, I'm not going to do it when I'm my age now, because I'll never do it. Mm-hmm. But you let yourself do things. You open yourself up to taking chances. And so, I did consulting, and then when you meet somebody and they say, gee, there may be something open, give yourself the freedom to really explore. I wouldn't be religious. I mean, obviously, if you want to be a doctor, it's one thing. Mm-hmm. But in my case, it was the freedom to take on new challenges, and see what happens. My feeling always was, if I didn't like it, I could leave, or they could fire me.
Right.
in the employment as well, at will, as you would say. But yeah, I think. But I like. I like teaching. I like talking with people. I'm nosy, and it pays.
Right. Is there anything that you would have done differently?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think they would, other than becoming maybe becoming this archaeologist that my high school guidance counselor said no. I don't know. You know, it's funny. Maybe at one point I was thinking about going to law school, but I never did. Maybe do that. But I've been lucky. I really feel that I've accomplished what I set out to do. I mean, my wife is wonderful. The kids are wonderful. The grandkids are wonderful. You know, we have a good life. I can't complain. Sure, there are things maybe. It's funny. Someone asked me, "Do I have a bucket list?" And I don't. I've been lucky. I walked across England.
The whole country?
Yeah, I walked from one coast of England over to the other coast of England. 220 miles or something. I did that in 1990. I've walked, as I said, I've been in the South Pacific. I've seen, I walked across Switzerland. I've been up in, down in Morocco and those places. So I can't complain. My life has been good.
Mm-hmm.
But sure, there are always things you would do differently. But politics is not one of those things. I have to tell you the funniest story. Years ago, I worked for a guy who was a New York State Assemblyman. He and I were friends. We had worked together at one point, and then he went into politics, and I was a legislative consultant to him.
Mm-hmm.
And one day I'm in the New York State Assembly whatever, where the New York State Assembly sits, and I'm in the well facing all the assemblymen, and there's a guy next to me. Never met him before, and he leans over to me and he goes, "Have you ever seen such a bunch of clowns in your life?" And I did is laugh. I mean, what else could I say? But I thought, man, do I want to be one of the clowns sitting in this place? But no, politics is one of those options that, never. Well, what are your goals? Enough of me. I'm going to interview you now.
Our goals.
It's difficult to say. I mean, I guess I'll go first. It's difficult to set goals without seeing where the end result could be.
Yeah,
but
that's true.
What you said about, I guess, you never know what's going to happen, a new opportunity, a person you speak to, I think that's beautiful, and personally I try to embrace that in my own life, and that's what really makes every day so exciting. You never know when you wake up, you're walking, you're on the corner, you meet someone new that completely alters the course of your life, and especially you just traveling so much. I think when typically kids our age, when you ask them about goals, the first answer they jump to is about your career, you know?
Sure.
Where do you want to be financially? Because that's what's so important to us. And maybe that's something that's changed from your generation over to ours. We might be more so, I guess, like slaves to making money. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. In some ways, that's what inspires us to get an education, to make the connections that we have. I think family is an important thing to have. It's an important thing to develop over time. And yeah, I guess career-wise, obviously that can't be ignored. I want to be in a place that I'm happy, in a place where I feel like I'm making ethical decisions, influencing people positively.
My goals, I think my goals are just to do the best I can.
Yeah.
When it comes to financially, of course, make as much money as I can while also staying true to my values. Creating a family and supporting my family the best that I can. And just in general, try not to miss out on opportunities that come by as much as possible.
Yeah. Well, I think in my generation, also I have to put, I grew up when the States, U.S. was in the Vietnam War. So college was very much involved with the whole Vietnam War.
Especially this one campus in Ohio, right?
Yeah. Young guy
Kent-
was
Kent
killed.
State, yeah.
It was, certainly when I was in school, I mean, there was still career. I mean, certainly family, I know in my family, my father encouraged me, I don't want you being a plumber, become a doctor, lawyer, Indian chief, something. I want you to be, something, good, things like that. So that certainly was, and then you had the Vietnam War, which was facing people. But I thought in my case, it was take on this adventure, see where it goes. It always was, I've never been afraid to try. I like hiking. That's one of my passions. And so I've done things like I've walked from Aspen over to like Telluride by myself. Wander. When I turned 30, I did the Outward Bound program. You know Outward Bound? Oh my God, you guys are too young. Outward Bound is a wilderness survival program, and they have campuses around the U.S. I did one in Maine. So I did that. I was the old man of the group. I was 30. Wandered the world. But, just take on, not be afraid to do it. You fail, you fail. You know what? You blow it, you blow it. And, you pick your ass up and you try it again. But it's one of those things where give yourself the chance to try it. That's the thing. Don't, lock yourself into something. I'm going to do this, and I don't give a damn about anything else. I mean, unless it's, it's so important that you want to do it. But, give yourself an opportunity. You would be surprised as to what is out there in terms of opportunity, choices, things you never thought about. That was one of the things we used to encourage students at school about capstone programs. Take on something you never would have done before to see if you like it. You may hate it, and you'll say, thank God, this is not what I want to do. Or you'll find that, gee, this is really fabulous. I'd like to do it. So give yourself that chance.
Interesting.
Okay. Well, if you don't have...
I do have one more question.
Sure.
You traveled so many places, unbelievably large amount. Not just traveled, but spent time living in these places. Why did you come back to New York?
It was home. It was home. It's where my family was, mother, father, sister. It's like I'm trying to come up with a intelligent analogy, and I'm not doing it. But I know I always could come home. That was the interesting part. Like when I wandered the world and I was in whatever, I knew I could always get on an airplane at some point and make my way back to New York. It was still, it was an anchor.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I wanted to come back. It was where I had family, friends. Also, I knew I had to get a job. and make money. No different than graduating school, you know.
Yeah.
And so I had to get back. But I knew that, you know, I was never going to make my life being up in like Nepal or something.
Is there another place that you would have chosen to live?
I love Vermont.
Really?
Yeah, I mean Vermont is wonderful. No, countries, this is fine. I mean, it's you know, I mean Israel was nice. I mean, I was glad to be there. It was, you know, you certainly feel part of it as being a Jew. You cannot not do that. But no, and the truth is that this country has been good to my family. My father, who really, and his brothers and sisters who struggled in this shtetl back in the 20s, came to America, and you know the family has done well. Same as my wife's family has done, and the country has been good to us. So there was never a sense of, you know, maybe you want to live in the south of France because it's pretty, or you like the food or whatever. But as a place to live, no, there is a sense of commitment that the U.S. has, for at least for our family, has been a wonderful, you know, opportunity that never would have had. And so I think there was a sense, talked about loyalty, there is a sense of loyalty. And New York is where I grew up, or Hoboken is where I grew up, so that's why.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you for coming
Thank
on
you.
for our first
Very much
interview.
so.
Yeah, you were an amazing.
I hope I haven't been 3 hours of dread.
No, of course not. You're an amazing guest,
Oh, thank you.
and we hope everybody watching got something out of our conversation.
Oh, thank you.
We have a lot of people in London who watch the podcast. For some
Really?
reason, yeah,
This is true.
geographically, we see this spread.
Well, I have to say, I'm British. British. My mother's mother is from Leeds, and so I grew up in a family in the States with names like Victoria, Mary, Anna. I had an uncle, Archibald, my uncle Archie. So very much connected to England. So
It's fun.
thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.